At the monastery of the 1,000 lotus petals, where the scent of incense lingered eternally in the air and bells chimed softly with the morning breeze, there lived a young monk whose story would echo through the ages. The monastery, built centuries ago on the slopes of a sacred mountain, was renowned as a sanctuary of peace and enlightenment, where countless practitioners had attained profound spiritual realizations. The ancient walls of the monastery held tales of transformation and awakening, but none could compare to the journey about to unfold. The young monk, who had arrived at the monastery as a child, stood out for his tireless dedication to the study of sutras and his natural compassion for all beings. His kindness was known throughout the monastery, from the most venerable masters to the humblest gardeners. When not immersed in sacred texts, he could be found assisting the elder monks with their daily tasks, tending to the monastery's garden, or helping prepare communal meals. His presence radiated an energy of goodwill and service that touched everyone around him. Yet behind his serene smile and virtuous actions, the young monk bore a burden known to few. Every morning, before the sun rose and the monastery was still cloaked in the silence of night, the young monk would retreat to the garden. There, among the lotus flowers rising from the waters of a small pond, he would sit on his meditation cushion, determined to achieve the mental clarity he observed in his fellow practitioners. But each attempt to still his mind was met with a storm of thoughts. Memories of the past, worries about the future, doubts about his spiritual progress, all arose like relentless waves on a turbulent sea. While other monks seemed to effortlessly enter deep states of samadhi, he struggled to maintain focus for even a few minutes. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the young monk's frustration grew silently. He watched his fellow practitioners meditating, their serene faces reflecting an inner peace that seemed increasingly beyond his grasp. Perhaps I am not worthy of the spiritual path, he thought, feeding an ever-deepening cycle of self-doubt. In his relentless pursuit of perfection in practice, the young monk became increasingly strict with himself. He woke even earlier, spent extra hours studying the sutras, and practiced late into the night, long after everyone else had retired. His determination was admirable, yet the harder he tried, the more realizations seemed to slip through his fingers like grains of sand. An elder monk, noticing his silent struggle, once told him, "Sometimes excessive effort can be as harmful as a lack of it." But the young monk, driven by his hunger for progress, could not fully grasp the meaning of those words. To him, every failed meditation session was confirmation of his inadequacy. Every moment of mental distraction was proof of his inability. As his self-criticism grew, subtle changes began to manifest in his behavior. His natural spontaneity gave way to self-imposed rigidity. His once frequent smiles became rarer. Even his acts of service, once performed with genuine joy, began to carry an undercurrent of tension. During monastery ceremonies, as sacred chants echoed through the ancient halls, the young monk found himself torn between the beauty of the present moment and the relentless self-assessment of his performance. Every breath became a struggle between the desire to be present and the harsh critique of his mind. One particularly challenging morning, something began to shift. After another frustrating meditation session, the young monk remained seated on his cushion, watching the sunrise over the monastery pond. The first light of day danced across the water, creating patterns of light that mirrored the thoughts in his mind, always in motion, always changing. At that moment, a gentle breeze swept through the garden, carrying cherry blossom petals that floated through the air before landing softly on the pond's surface. The young monk observed how each petal momentarily disturbed the water, creating ripples that expanded outward before eventually fading, leaving the water serene once more. It was then that the first seed of understanding began to take root in his heart. Perhaps his pursuit of perfection, his constant battle against his thoughts, was like trying to prevent the petals from touching the water. Perhaps there was a greater wisdom in allowing the ripples to form and naturally subside. This realization, though subtle, marked the first step on a journey that would take him far beyond the monastery walls in search of a deeper understanding, not only of meditation, but of his own essential nature. That morning, something different lingered in the air of the monastery. The weight of frustration had become almost unbearable for the young monk, and his feet instinctively carried him beyond the temple gates. The valley stretching below the monastery was renowned for its wild beauty and sparse population. Ancient stories spoke of hermits and sages who had found enlightenment in its verdant depths, far from the eyes of the world. As he descended the winding path that snaked along the mountainside, the young monk noticed how the vegetation grew denser and the air more humid. The sound of the monastery's bells gradually gave way to birdsong and the gentle murmur of a distant stream. Each step took him deeper, not just into the valley, but into his own introspection. Then, in an unexpected clearing, he came upon a small cabin. What caught his attention first was not the modest, simple structure, but the extraordinary garden surrounding it. It was a spectacle of colors and life, where flowers of various species coexisted in a harmony that seemed to transcend the ordinary laws of nature. Flowers that normally would not bloom in the same season shared the same space, as though time itself had bent to allow such a miracle. Amid this miniature paradise, an elderly woman worked with fluid, precise movements. Her snow-white hair was tied in a simple bun, and her robes, though worn by time, exuded a natural dignity. Most striking, however, was her expression, a serene smile that seemed to hold all the wisdom of the universe. The elderly woman hummed softly as she watered her plants, even those that were visibly wilting under the intense midday sun. Her song was not a lament for the flower's imminent demise, but a celebration of life in all its phases. The young monk, accustomed to viewing imperfection as something to be corrected, was intrigued by this seemingly contradictory acceptance. "You must be wondering why I sing to flowers that are dying," the woman said suddenly, without turning around, as if she had been expecting his arrival. The young monk, surprised at how precisely she had read his thoughts, nodded silently. "Come," she gestured, "help me water these flowers." As he approached, she handed him a bamboo watering can and began to share her wisdom. Every wilting flower is a teacher of impermanence. It shows us that beauty lies not only in blooming, but in the entire cycle of life. The same flower that returns to the earth today will nourish the blooms of the next spring. For hours, the young monk worked alongside the elderly woman in the garden. She taught him about each plant, not just its name and needs, but the spiritual lessons it carried. Orchids spoke of the beauty of growing at one's own pace. Roses demonstrated how protection, thorns, and beauty were two sides of the same coin. Tiny wild daisies showed the strength that lies in simplicity. "Look at these wildflowers," she said, pointing to a seemingly chaotic patch. "No one planted them, no one decided where they should grow. They simply are, and in their natural state, they create perfect harmony. How often do we try to force our growth in one direction when our true nature already knows exactly where we should go?" As they worked, the elderly woman shared a teaching that contradicted much of what the young monk had learned about effort and practice. There is a subtle difference between cultivating and forcing. When we cultivate, we create the conditions for something to flourish naturally. When we force, we impose our will on the natural process, often causing more harm than good. She showed him a lotus flower that had recently been transplanted. "This lotus," she explained, "does not need instructions on how to grow. It already carries within it all the wisdom of its kind. Our role is simply to provide the right conditions, water, sunlight, nutrients, and then trust the natural process." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, the elderly woman led the young monk to a special patch of soil. Here, wilted flowers and dried leaves were carefully collected and turned into compost. Many see death as an end, she said, plunging her hands into the rich, dark earth. But it is merely a transformation. These flowers that have wilted have not ceased to exist. They are becoming nourishment for the next generation. In the same way, our failures, our imperfections, our moments of doubt are not obstacles on our path. They are the very fertile soil from which our wisdom will grow. As the first stars began to dot the sky, the young monk realized he had received far more than simple gardening lessons. Each flower, each weed, each moment of care for the garden had been a mirror for his own spiritual journey. Sensing the depth of his contemplation, the elderly woman smiled gently and said, "Come back tomorrow, young monk. The garden has much more to teach you, and you have only just begun to learn its language." That night, as he returned to the monastery under the moonlight, the young monk carried with him not just the scent of the flowers, but also the seeds of a new understanding. His quest for perfection was beginning to transform into something deeper, an acceptance of the natural process of growth and transformation. On the third day, the monastery of the 1,000 lotus petals awoke to something different. Even before the first rays of sunlight touched the mountains, the young monk was already making his way toward the valley, his heart beating with a newfound sense of anticipation. The lessons of the garden still echoed in his mind, mingling with the morning dew that clung to every leaf and flower along his path. This time, upon reaching the old woman's cabin, he found her sitting silently at her door, as though she had been expecting him. Without a word, she stood and motioned for him to follow. The path they took was different, an almost invisible trail winding through ancient trees. After a contemplative walk in silence, they arrived at a hidden lake nestled among the mountains. The water's surface was like a flawless mirror, reflecting the morning sky so perfectly that it was difficult to distinguish where reality ended and reflection began. The old woman sat by the lake's edge and gestured for the young monk to do the same. "Observe," she said softly, picking up a small stone and tossing it into the water. The impact created concentric ripples that expanded across the surface, distorting the once perfect reflection. "Your mind is like this lake," she explained. "Thoughts are like these ripples. They arise, disturb the surface. But if you do not create more waves by resisting them, they will naturally settle." For hours, they remained there, observing the many faces of the lake. They watched how the wind created gentle ripples, how birds landing on the water caused momentary disturbances, and how falling leaves left their own patterns on the surface. "Notice how the lake rejects nothing," the old woman observed. "It accepts every disturbance, every reflection, every movement. It doesn't fight the wind, resent the birds, or try to stop the leaves from falling. It embraces all, and in that acceptance, it finds its peace." The young monk began to understand that his struggle for perfection in meditation was like trying to force the lake to remain perfectly still. "But Master," he asked, "how can I meditate properly if I don't control my thoughts?" The old woman smiled compassionately. Who is trying to control, and what is being controlled? Are they not both parts of the same mind? It's like a hand trying to grasp itself. The harder it tries, the more it slips out of its own reach. As they spoke, clouds began to form in the sky, their reflections appearing on the lake's surface. "Observe the clouds," the old woman instructed. "They come and go on their own. We don't need to do anything to move them. Your thoughts are like these clouds, naturally transient. The problem isn't the thoughts themselves, but our habit of trying to hold on to them or push them away." For hours, they practiced this new form of meditation together. Instead of battling his thoughts, the young monk learned to watch them as passing clouds in the sky of his consciousness. When he became distracted, the old woman gently reminded him, "Don't fight. Just observe. Don't judge. Simply acknowledge." Later in the afternoon, they discovered an old weathered boat abandoned on the lake shore. Though aged, it still floated. The old woman asked the young monk to push it into the water. See how the boat floats, she said. It doesn't need to exert effort to stay afloat. That's its nature. Similarly, the peace and clarity you seek are your essential nature. We don't need to create peace. We only need to stop creating agitation. As the sun began to set, casting golden rays across the lake, the old woman shared a final teaching. Beneath the waves, at the lake's depths, the water remains calm, no matter what happens on the surface. In the same way, beneath your thoughts and emotions lies a deep awareness that is always undisturbed, always at peace. But how do I find that depth? The young monk asked. It's not something you find, she replied. It's something you are. Deep water doesn't need to seek depth. It already is deep. Our true nature is like the depth, always present, always at peace, only temporarily obscured by the agitation on the surface. As night fell and they made their way back through the forest, the young monk realized that something had shifted within him. The constant pressure he felt to achieve perfection had begun to dissolve, like mist under the morning sun. Remember, the old woman said as they parted ways, meditation isn't a technique to become something different. It's an invitation to recognize what you already are. Like the lake that naturally reflects the sky when calm, your mind will naturally reflect wisdom when it rests in its true nature. That night, as the young monk sat on his meditation cushion in the monastery, he experienced for the first time what it truly meant to meditate. It was no longer a struggle to reach a special state, but a profound relaxation into something that had always been there, like a lake returning to its serene nature. The following morning, when the young monk arrived at the elder's cabin, he found her kneeling before a single ceramic pot, still empty. Beside it lay a tiny lotus seed, no larger than his pinky fingernail. The morning dew still glistened on the garden flowers as she looked up and said, "Today marks the beginning of your true test." The elder picked up the tiny seed with her wrinkled hands and held it out to the young monk. For 100 days, you will care for this single seed, this single pot, and the single flower it will become. No more, no less. It will be your mirror, your teacher, your practice. With precise, deliberate movements, the elder taught him how to prepare the soil. Just as we prepare the earth to receive the seed, she explained, we must prepare our minds to receive wisdom. Not too compact, not too loose, not too wet, not too dry. The middle way is the key. Together, they mixed the soil with organic compost, creating a rich, nutrient-filled base. The elder explained how each element served its purpose. Sand for drainage, decomposed leaves for nourishment, clay for structure. Similarly, in our spiritual practice, we need different elements in balance. The first days were the most challenging. The young monk anxiously watched the seemingly barren soil, searching for any sign of life. Why is nothing happening? He asked on the 5th day, impatience evident in his voice. The elder smiled. Beneath the soil, hidden from our eyes, the greatest transformation is taking place. The seed is dying so that the plant can be born. Sometimes, the greatest growth happens during moments of apparent stillness. On the 10th day, when there was still no visible sign of growth, the young monk found the elder contemplating an ancient cherry tree. "How old do you think this tree is?" she asked. "Perhaps 100 years?" he guessed. 312, she corrected. For 312 cycles of seasons, it has grown, blossomed, shed its leaves, and been reborn. There was never haste, never delay, only the perfect timing of nature. It was on the 15th day that the first sign of life appeared, a tiny green sprout, no larger than a strand of hair. The young monk was overjoyed, but the elder warned him, "Now comes the real test. Initial enthusiasm is easy. Maintaining steady care day after day, that is the true challenge." As the weeks passed, the young monk faced many trials. There were days of intense heat, when the soil dried out quickly and days of heavy rain, when too much water threatened to drown the fragile plant. Each day brought its own lesson. Observe how the plant responds to different conditions, the elder guided him. It does not complain about the heat or resent the rain. It adapts, grows, finds its way. This is true wisdom. On the 40th day, small insects began appearing on the plant's leaves. The monk's first instinct was to remove them immediately, but the elder stopped him. Before acting, observe, she instructed. Not every insect is a pest. Some are pollinators. Others maintain the ecosystem's balance. Similarly, not every negative thought in our mind must be eliminated. Sometimes these challenges strengthen our practice. As the days passed, the weather began to change. Mornings grew colder, the sun less intense. The young monk worried about how these changes might affect his plant. The seasons change, just as our mental states do, the elder explained. The true practice is not in keeping everything constant, but in learning to flow with life's natural changes. On the 70th day, the elder asked the young monk to closely observe his plant. "What do you see?" she asked. "I see strong leaves, a firm stem, and the first bud beginning to form," he replied. "And what do you not see?" The monk fell silent, contemplating her question. "You do not see your own expectations, fears, or anxieties," she explained. "In the beginning, you projected so much of yourself onto the plant that you could barely see it as it truly was. Now, you are beginning to see with clarity." In the final weeks of the test, the young monk realized he had learned more about himself than about gardening. Each moment spent caring for the plant had been a moment of self-discovery. The plant was only a mirror, the elder said on the 90th day. Through it, you have learned patience, acceptance, perseverance, and detachment. Every drop of water you gave was a lesson in care and attention. Every leaf that sprouted was a teaching on the natural timing of things. And so, day by day, the young monk continued his practice, realizing that the true growth was not only in the plant he tended, but in the silent transformation taking place within his own heart. The 99th day dawned with a gentle mist blanketing the valley. The young monk made his usual way to the elder's hut, carrying with utmost care the pot that held his precious lotus flower. After more than 3 months of daily dedication, the plant was magnificent, its green, vibrant leaves spread in perfect symmetry, and a robust bud promised to bloom at any moment. The path that once felt so new and challenging had become familiar, each stone and curve now like old friends on his daily journey. His steps were firm and confident, the result of countless trips between the monastery and the elder's hut. Then it happened, a moment that would change everything. A small stone, previously unnoticed on the path, caused his foot to slip slightly. The movement, though subtle, was enough for the pot to slip from his hands. As if in slow motion, he watched the precious vessel fall, spin in the air, and shatter against the rocky ground. The sound of the ceramic breaking echoed through the valley like thunder in his heart. Soil, water, roots, and shards of pottery scattered across the ground. The plant he had tended with such care, to which he had devoted 99 days of unwavering attention, now lay exposed and vulnerable on the path. For a few moments, the young monk stood frozen, his heart pounding so hard it seemed ready to leap from his chest. All his practiced equanimity seemed to vanish instantly. Tears welled in his eyes as thoughts of failure and self-condemnation flooded his mind. All the work, all the dedication, ruined in a single moment of carelessness, he thought, feeling the crushing weight of what he saw as his greatest failure. The irony was not lost on him, being so close to the end, only to fail at the very last moment. With trembling hands, he began to gather the shards and the damaged plant. It was then that he heard the gentle steps of the elder approaching. She had witnessed everything from afar and was now standing there, her serene face contrasting with the young monk's visible anguish. "Master," I failed, he said, his voice breaking. 99 days of care, destroyed in one careless second. To his surprise, the elder smiled. A radiant, compassionate smile that seemed to cut through the morning mist. Now, she said softly, you are ready for the true lesson. With kindness, the elder knelt beside the fragments and began to help him gather them. Tell me, she asked, what do you see here? I see destruction, he replied sadly. I see the end of all my work. Look deeper, she encouraged. What else do you see? The young monk looked again. Through his tears, he began to notice something different. The plant's roots, previously hidden by the pot, were now exposed a complex and intricate system that had developed over the past months, far more beautiful and intricate than he had imagined. The pot, the elder explained, was like your old perception of yourself, a rigid, limited form you created to contain yourself. Sometimes we need to break to discover the treasure that lies beyond our self-imposed limitations. She gently held up the plant, showing how its roots had grown in surprising patterns. Look how it grew, not just in the direction you could see, but in all directions. This is our true nature, far more vast and complex than the limited form we try to confine ourselves within. For hours, sitting among the shards of the broken pot, the elder shared some of the deepest teachings the young monk had ever received. She spoke about how our greatest lessons often come from apparent failures, how our wounds can become doors to deeper understanding. The broken pot, she explained, is a far greater teacher than the intact pot could ever have been. It teaches us about impermanence, about letting go, and about the beauty that can emerge from what we consider broken. Together, they took the plant and transferred it into a new, larger pot, one better suited to its continued growth. The elder showed the young monk how the roots now had more space to expand, how the plant could grow in ways the previous pot could never have allowed. See, she said, sometimes what seems like a catastrophe is actually a liberation. The broken pot was not the end of the journey. It was the beginning of a new phase of growth. By the end of that transformative day, the young monk understood that the true test had never been about keeping the pot intact or cultivating the perfect plant. It was about learning to see the beauty and wisdom that can arise from our breaks and imperfections. Remember, the elder said, as the sun set, it is not our perfect achievements that transform us, but how we respond to the moments when we break. It is through our cracks that the deepest light can enter. The day after the incident with the broken vase, the young monk returned to the monastery with a different stride than he had taken during all the previous months. His walk was no longer that of someone seeking perfection, but of someone who had found something far more precious, the understanding of beauty within imperfection. The other monks, who had observed his daily journey to the valley for months, immediately noticed the change. It wasn't an outward transformation. He still wore the same simple robes, kept to the same schedule, and performed his daily tasks as usual. The change lay in something subtler, deeper. There's something different about you, commented one of the elder monks during the morning meal. It's as if a tension you've carried for years has finally dissolved. The young monk smiled, recalling the words of the elder woman. Sometimes we need to break to discover who we truly are. His pursuit of perfection in meditation, which had once tormented him, had transformed into something entirely different, a profound acceptance of the present moment, just as it was. During the meditation sessions in the monastery's main hall, the other monks began to notice a fundamental shift in the way the young monk practiced. Gone was the visible tension in his shoulders, the rigidity in his posture that seemed to cry out effort. Instead, he sat with a natural ease that seemed to emanate from his innermost being. Thoughts still arose as they always would, but now he observed them as he had observed the clouds reflected in the lake with the elder woman, letting them pass without attachment or aversion. Over time, novice monks began seeking him out, curious about his transformation. One young novice, particularly frustrated with his practice, approached him after a meditation session. "How do you maintain such serenity?" the novice asked. "My mind is always so restless." The young monk, remembering his own journey, led the novice to the monastery garden. There, among the flowers and the gentle breeze, he began to share the teachings he had received from the elder woman in the valley. The monastery garden became his new place of teaching. There, he shared the lessons he had learned, how every flower has its own time to bloom, how the dry seasons are just as vital as the rainy ones, how even weeds have their role in the great cycle of life. "Look at this lotus flower," he would say to those who sought his guidance. "It doesn't struggle to emerge from the mud. It is its nature to do so." In the same way, our true nature is clarity and peace. We don't need to fight to create it. We only need to remove the obstacles that prevent us from recognizing it. As the years passed, the young monk continued his practice, but now with a fundamentally different understanding. Meditation was no longer a technique to achieve a special state, but a natural return to what had always been present. He now understood that the perfection he had once sought was not about eliminating all thoughts or maintaining an unshakably calm mind. True perfection lay in fully accepting the present moment with all its apparent imperfections. The wisdom of the elder woman in the valley lived on through him. Whenever he encountered a practitioner struggling with their practice, he remembered the broken vase, the clouds in the lake, and the lotus flower that grew in its own perfect time. Our true nature, he shared, is like the sky, sometimes clear, sometimes cloudy, but always vast and unchanging in its essence. Our thoughts and emotions are like the weather, always shifting, always passing. And so, the story of the young monk became an eternal reminder of a profound truth. The path to unlocking a better version of ourselves does not lie in an endless pursuit of perfection, but in the deep acceptance of who we truly are. True transformation doesn't come from striving to be something different, but from peeling away the layers of expectations, judgments, and self-imposed limitations that prevent us from seeing our original nature, which, like the lotus flower, already holds all the beauty and wisdom we need. In this way, the story reminds us that each of us is like that lotus seed, already containing within us the full potential to bloom. Our journey is not about becoming something we are not, but about removing the obstacles that keep us from recognizing the beauty and wisdom that have always been present in our true selves.